if it's the last thing that I do. And right now, I realize it's probably a hopeless struggle, but at the same time, I kind of feel like it's something that has to be done, because if some of us don't do it, then who will? On the issue of the income tax, you're absolutely right about that. In fact, it's codified in Title 26 of the United States Code. And the interesting thing about it is, if you go to any law library, you will notice that it has been positively enacted into law. When you open up the inside of the book where the code is, it'll have a little asterisk by it. So Title 26 of the United States Code doesn't have an asterisk by it, and that means it was never actually positively enacted into law. Because it is not positively enacted into law, the way that they actually enforce the law is through your contractual agreement to, submit to the law. So whenever you go to get a bank account, and you have a signature card on that bank account, if you read the rules and regulations that you're agreeing to when you sign that signature card, you will notice that you are agreeing to the rules contained in Title 26 of the United States Code, which is the income tax. And so basically, if you are being suspected of committing any type of tax crime, the first thing that they will do before even pressing charges against you is they will figure out where you bank, and they will go pull the signature cards on those bank accounts. And then when they pull signature cards on those bank accounts, they actually have proof that you agreed to waive your Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights, in addition to assenting to Title 26 of the United States Code. So then when you go before the federal judge or the tax court or whatever it may be, and you try to argue that they cannot use your bank statements against you because it's an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment or it's self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment, they laugh at you and they don't accept those arguments, because their argument is you signed away that right, you waived your Fourth and Fifth Amendment right when you signed on to that bank account. Now, what this all tells me is that we have a system in place right now that is based not upon system, but it's based on coercion. And when you have a system based on coercion, you have a system that's based on dishonesty, and you have a system that's based on lies, sooner or later it's going to collapse, because eventually the truth will get out, and eventually people will just say, no more, this isn't right, and we've got to stand up for something. So you're kind of getting to that point now, and, but will people do it? Do people recognize this kind of stuff? And it was incredible to me, because when we were talking about constitutional law in some of my classes with citizens, the subject of impeachment came up. And it has become pretty clear that our current president may have committed as many as 2 impeachable offenses already to date, one being that he presided over the UN Security Council meeting last year. He's not supposed to preside over anything besides our government. And then the second time was when he actually turned Arizona into the UN for a human rights violation. So both of those might be considered treason and indeed impeachable offenses. It's not going to happen. And I think the reason we need to ask, or the thing we need to ask, is why not?
That's
Margo,
true. John,
Margo,
you've got an interesting question here on the sovereign movement, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
Margo, you mentioned about the contract, and most statutes are contractual. I know several people within the movement, so to speak, that are seeking sovereignty, liquidating their fiduciary relationship with their straw man. Have you heard about this?
There is something called a sovereign citizen movement. And I am familiar with the movement. I've heard a lot about it. It goes back, I mean, there's so many arguments that I know that they use, from the fringe being on the American flag to even having a driver's license and requirement of tags on a car being as restrictive of a person's constitutional right to freedom of travel. The problem is, though, and I've actually talked to federal and state level judges about this, is that most federal and state judges consider sovereign citizens to be terrorists. And whenever they file actions in court, whenever law enforcement authorities catch wind of them, it doesn't matter whether they are peaceful people or whether they're
the Unabomber.
Yes, the Unabomber. He was a sovereign citizen. And then, of course, you've got the Anti-Defamation League that has actually come after a lot of these people. And so, there is a stereotype where, not unlike the current claims of racism that are getting lobbed at the Tea Party, where you have a group of individuals, whether or not these individuals are terrorists or not, they're all getting lobbed into the terrorist group, much like what they're trying to do with the MIAC report in Missouri. So it's unfortunate, but where on earth does a person go if they want to be sovereign? And that's kind of a question that I've always wondered. I mean, if we can't even have sovereignty in this country for people that want it, then where on earth are they supposed to go? And, it's kind of interesting because in our country's early history, Native Americans were kind of considered sovereign because they weren't allowed to vote and they didn't pay taxes, and they generally got assimilated and integrated into our system. And so basically there really is no room, technically, according to our, current government, for sovereign citizens. They all kind of get lumped into the terrorism category, which is really unfortunate, I think, because I think some of the arguments that sovereign citizens are something that's valid, and maybe our system should look into some of those issues.
Okay, and I understand that you recently became aware that just something isn't right, and what we say in the movement is you woke up. What woke you up, and if you were sitting down for a dinner or a luncheon with a fellow attorney, what would you say to them in order to bring them around to point them in the right direction to see things from your perspective now that you know that something's just not right?
Well, actually, I've been kind of noticing that things haven't been right for a while. I held on to the notion that maybe if I got a law degree, I could change things, or I could help to change things. And then, of course, once I got into the system and started working within it and realizing how it works, I started realizing exactly how futile a lot of my efforts were. Anytime that I've tried to discuss a lot of these things with colleagues, it hasn't gone over very well. You're going to be very hard-pressed to find an attorney that's a libertarian, and if one openly admits it, it's even a bigger deal. I think there's maybe quite a few closet libertarian lawyers. I don't think there's many that will actually come out and say it. And the reason they won't come out and say it is, whether we like it or not, law as a profession is a business. And the business of lawyers is creating laws to keep perpetuating their business. So, for instance, if you have a regulation that, for instance, makes it a tort to take some sort of a medication and be injured by that medication. For instance, there's a lot of drug torts going on right now, things like hormone replacement therapy and Vioxx and stuff like that. Well, there's lobbyists, and most of those lobbyists are lawyers. And the reason that they lobby for these regulations and these laws is because it creates more business for them. It creates more ways to sue and more ways for them to get rich and take a percentage of a person's damages under that suit. So really, the problem is that law has become a business. And if it's a business, there's really very little incentive for most lawyers to decrease their business by decreasing regulation.
Well, that was well said for sure. And I mean, think about this. Here's a great example of that. What profession makes up the majority of our representatives and senators in our legislative branch? Lawyers. Well, what do you think? Do you think that they would actually do the right thing by health care or health insurance by doing tort reform? You'll never get lawyers to reform the tort laws as long as they're in there. That's why it's so important that when we do have these elections, that we get people that aren't lawyers in there that can make those difficult decisions that need to be made. And for somebody who's, say, a physicist, that's not so difficult. Yeah, hello, tort reform, okay, no problem. But you won't get that as long as you have lawyers running the show in Washington.
And I completely agree with you because I think you're absolutely right. The majority of the politicians are lawyers. The majority of lobbyists are lawyers. There are so many lawyers in our country, and I find that very interesting because there's only really two things that the federal government is supposed to do under the Constitution. One is national security, and the second one is to keep people secure in their persons and their property. So basically, criminal and property law. And now, I mean, we have laws for everything. In fact, there are so many laws that, and these laws are thousands of pages long. I mean, look at the health care bill. And I read that entire thing, and let me tell you, it's a monster of unintended consequences. And, the incredible thing is, how can we expect people to say that ignorance of the law is no excuse when there are thousands of laws, they're thousands of pages long, and even one lawyer can't possibly know all the laws that, are on the books in this country, so much so that lawyers have become highly specialized. I mean, it's not, it's very much like being a doctor at this point. You don't just go to a heart doctor if you have, a brain disease like Parkinson's. Well, the same thing occurs within the law. And I find it absolutely insane how much legislation we are passing for things that actually have no constitutional basis within the federal government whatsoever.
Absolutely right. I've got a caller on the line. I'm going to bring him on. Brian from South Carolina, you are live on the air.
Hello, folks. It's nice talking to you tonight. It's nice hearing you for the first time, ma'am. I don't believe I've ever heard you speak. Everybody comments on, I'm going to leave the I heard it was Jesse Ventura and Alex Jones was on their show. They were talking about leaving the country and going somewhere else. And what people don't realize, there is nowhere else to go. And one of the questions I have is, if you were to become an expatriate, and this is for you, AC, where would you go? Is there another country out there that's not under the bankers, that's not in this system, that's outside the system, like New Zealand was, for instance, say, 20 years ago?
I would go to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in the wilderness, right along the Canadian border. I realize that's not out of the country. I certainly wouldn't go out of the country. I think a lot of people are probably making mistakes by doing that. But
yeah, I agree.
I think if you can withstand the misery of the snow and ice and the miserable conditions, Upper Michigan, Upper Peninsula would be a good place to be.
Right. Well, I'm of the train of thought that I'm going to stay right here and make my stand. That was the train of thought of our ancestors when they, in 1776, and it's really, it goes back to Europe. A lot of people don't realize in Europe, There was a lot of theocracies that were intertwined with religion, and it was just a bloodbath. It just, as soon as one person took over, and the authority